everyone. It's great to see everyone here. I'm thrilled to see the participation for our Livable Communities and Smart Growth Symposium, the first one in Broome County, the first of many. My name is Claudia Edwards. I'm the Public Health Director here, and I would like to just thank the cross-section of attendees here that I see. We have elected officials here. I'd like to acknowledge Patrick Brennan is our county executive, Matt Ryan, mayor of City of Binghamton, Mr. Marinaccio, town supervisor have attended. We have institutions of higher learning here, SUNY Binghamton. We have hospitals here represented. We have our Livable Communities Alliance members. We have the Rural Health Network. We have many community-based organizations, and rightly so. This is a fascinating subject. We talk about smart growth. The term itself makes such common sense. Smart growth, do it right when you're growing. And I would like to just share with you my own perspective about this, which is taken from the New York State Smart Growth Cabinet. Smart growth as a sensible, planned, efficient growth that integrates economic development and job creation with community quality of life by preserving and enhancing the built and natural environments and promoting social equity. And that is quite a mouthful, but it makes so much sense. You tie those concepts to doing health impact assessments, and you will begin to see how the determinants of things like chronic disease begin to have answers. So there is so much potential in this whole concept, in this whole program. And I would like to really just take 1 minute and thank Tariq Abdelazim, where are you, Tariq? For pulling together this whole conference and realizing that the community really does need training in this. And Tariq is the planner from the City of Binghamton. So thank you, Tariq. I've been fortunate to be able to report to a county executive, our new county executive, Patrick Brennan, and he has supported many health projects, and this is much bigger than a health project. But Mr. Brennan's role prior to being county executive was deputy county executive, and he was intimately tied to this project of the intermodal hub in Binghamton, which is a smart growth project. So he's got a world of experience, and he's supported and developed public transportation for everyone in the county through this project. So with that, I would like to bring Pat Brennan on board. Pat?
Thank you, Claudia. Good morning, everyone. As Claudia said, I'm the county executive now. I've been in that position for a month, and it's been very busy and hectic, but I like the job. Several events like this, it's fun to interact with everyone and welcome here to this symposium. And I'll be very brief. I know Matt has a few things to say. And I thought I'd just expand a little bit on the intermodal. We have a couple thousand square feet left of space that we want to rent out. So if you know anybody that wants to start a business downtown, we have to market that space. We also have the finishing touches going on a diner and a new request for proposals for people to run the diner, and we also have a gift shop that'll go out to bid, or not bid, but request for proposals. So if you know anyone that wants to start a nice little business downtown, have them give me a call. Now I'll turn it over to Mayor Ryan.
Thank you and good morning. I want to welcome all those to today's symposium, which is a culmination of months of preparation by members of the Livable Communities Alliance, a positive, forward-thinking collaboration across the public, private, nonprofit sectors that focuses on smart regional planning and local development practices that will restore our urban's economic vitality and improve the quality of life for all residents in urban, suburban, and rural communities. Over the past 5 years, my administration has been guided by a consistent set of values and goals that we need to take bold steps towards a more sustainable and equitable economy, that government must be transparent, accountable, respectful of diverse voices, and responsive to everybody's needs, that we need to value our national and historic resources, that we need to not only attract and retain private capital, but also cultivate and grow our social and civic capital. And finally, that we need to look past provincial interests and come together as a region if we ever hope to restore prosperity and vitality to the valley that we all know, the Valley of Innovation. So today's event, the second major community event hosted by the Livable Communities Alliance, is an important milestone in this journey. It is another step towards engaging all stakeholders in a common vision for our region's future and learning more about proven policies and strategies that can help us move closer to that shared vision. Today's symposium will help us better understand how to incentivize and guide the next 30 years of public investments in order to build healthier, more sustainable, more livable communities. Today's speakers will help us better understand the connections between public health and wellness, our built environment, land use and transportation, and how shifting market preferences and an aging demographic must inform our policy decisions today to realize benefits for tomorrow. I want to personally thank many of our partners that have been working for years towards this goal in transportation, the elderly community, public health and wellness, environmental protection, local business development, and sustainability. And I want to promise today that the city will remain very committed to strengthen these efforts in the years to come so we can translate our common goals into smart, progressive policy reforms that will position our region and current and future residents for long-term success. So enjoy the conference today. It's going to be, there's some great speakers. I think we're all going to learn a lot and continue down this path. And the one thing that's great is the partnerships that form. We've been big about partnerships. I think you know that. We always talk about partnerships. And seeing all the people in this room together to learn about how we can progress as a community I'm really grateful for that. And let's give a round of applause to all the people, especially Tariq Abzalazine, who's and all the people who have organized this conference this morning. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Mary McFadden, who will be emceeing the event today. Mary is Program Coordinator for the Broome County Strategic Alliance for Health, a great collaboration in which the city is a proud and active participant. Mary has played an active role in organizing this event as a member of the Livable Communities Alliance Planning Committee, and she's always doing good things to promote health in our whole region. So, Mary McFadden.
Thank you, Mayor Ryan. I actually started at registration table this Monday, and today I am your MC. So that to me is an example of smart growth right off the bat. We are so excited to present to you today's conference. Today you will have the opportunity to listen to and engage with an incredible array of national level speakers who will discuss smart growth in the context of economic development, job creation, health benefits, demographic and market changes, and transportation and investment opportunities. You will also hear from inspirational leaders across upstate New York about ongoing regional initiatives aimed at strengthening local economies, improving the quality of life through policy, legislation, and reform. And like Mayor Ryan said, we couldn't do this without the Livable Communities Alliance. Today was really generated by all their efforts, and we have a host of sectors representing a host of all of our priority populations that we are trying to reach in our community to engage them in a healthy existence. So on behalf of the Livable Communities Alliance, we would like to acknowledge our sponsors for today, which is Newman Development Group, Security Mutual, Hinman, Howard and Cantel, the Binghamton Riverwalk Hotel and Conference Center, Chanis and Anderson, Bersch Compo, Knudsen Architects and Engineers, the Binghamton Regional Sustainability Coalition, and the Broome County Strategic Alliance for Health, along with the Binghamton Local Development Incorporation. At this point in time, I would like you to lose yourself in livability and sink your senses into smart growth. We are kicking off our day with our first speaker, and that first speaker will be introduced by one of our planning committee members, Mr. Mark Bowers.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming out this morning. I kind of asked Mary if I could do this because yesterday I had an opportunity to spend some time with Ellen Dunham Jones, and all you have to do is look at the program and look at all the accolades, the places that she's been, the things that she's done, and I'm not going to read that from the program. Everyone can do that, and maybe you saw it on the website. But the reason I want to introduce Ellen is that what I think is most important here is that this woman is just a quality person. After spending some time with her yesterday, Zach and I gave her a whirlwind tour of the good, the bad, and the ugly here in Broome County coming back from the airport, and we were able to have dinner with her last night. But this is a woman that truly cares, that she cares about people, that she cares about her students, her university, and that she really understands the greater good. And that if we all take chances, if we put ourselves out there, and if we collaborate like this, we can accomplish anything. And all you have to do is look at her information to see what she's done. So I'm just very proud to be able to stand here today, to have this woman. We had seen her a year ago up in Rochester, and she's fantastic. Everybody's going to love this, and I feel better because I had some time to spend with her, and I know that everybody here will too. So here's Ellen Dunham Jones.
That's a lot to live up to at 8:30 in the morning. Thank you, Mark. I'm delighted to be here and to share with you some of the work that my co-author, June Williamson, and I have done and put together in a recent book. But also, I think really to try to help stimulate your imaginations. We all, in this country, I mean, we're all kind of expect our cities to grow, and this, seeing cranes downtown is a sign of a good, healthy economy. A little bit of change, it's always, you hate to see the places you love change, but at the same time, you recognize that cities are expected to evolve. Yet, we seem to have an expectation that the suburbs should remain forever frozen in whatever form they were initially birthed in, and that we have a right to expect the suburbs never to change. Well, a lot of suburban properties are beloved places. They will remain wonderful, wonderful places for decades to come. Most of those were built in the 20s. Most of the post-war suburbs, they're getting kind of old. They're aging. The recession has absolutely led to even more sort of proliferation of vacancies. And so we find ourselves surrounded by a lot of vacant big box stores, dead malls, dying commercial strip corridors, aging office parks, aging subdivisions. And so it's time, we need to start figuring out what to do with these places. And whereas most people kind of find those landscapes sort of depressing, I admit that I look at them and I go, hey, opportunity! Now we can re-inhabit, redevelop, regreen these places into much more sustainable places and frankly, make them better. Even though it sort of goes, most people can't quite imagine it. So I'm going to show in the book we document about 80 case studies. We're up to about 200. I'm going to show you some examples. And I really, we do them, I'm going to talk about them in terms of 3 basic strategies. Re-inhabitation with more community-serving uses, redevelopment, where you're actually scraping and urbanizing the site, and regreening. Sometimes we shouldn't have ever built there in the first place, and it makes more sense to restore the ecology. So, but before I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we should be thinking about retrofitting suburbia and suburban property types, I get accused often of people saying, we should be focusing our attention on downtowns. You shouldn't be distracting or competing with downtowns. Of course we should. We've actually done a pretty great job of seeing our downtown, many of our downtowns, most of our downtowns really, are bouncing back. The recession has hit everybody hard and slowed some of that. But there are also a lot of reasons why we need to look at the suburbs. And I'm going to breeze through these pretty quickly. But number one, climate change. On average, U.S. urban dwellers have 1/3 the carbon footprint of suburban dwellers. And I know Matt Lister is going to get into this in more detail in his talk. But basically, and you can kind of guess why. Why would suburbanites have a larger carbon footprint? There's interactive here. Everybody can guess the first reason. Driving, cars. The second reason is a little less obvious, but it's all those detached buildings. Detached buildings mean you have more surface area to lose energy out of. And they do, and most of our buildings are leaky. So between those two, when you measure greenhouse gas emissions on a per capita basis, not just on a per acre basis, but per capita, the cities are relatively green. Here's San Francisco and Oakland. They're already, relatively green. If we really want to get serious about carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, the bigger target is in fact all the yellow and red out in the suburbs. Next slide. All that driving, of course, leads to greater dependence on foreign oil. And there's all sorts of statistics, but it basically, our vehicle miles traveled over the last couple of decades has risen at 5 times the rate of population growth because of our development patterns. We've just been, sprawling further and further out, making more and more people requiring every trip to be by car. The Joint Chiefs of Staff actually see this as a national security problem, and for a variety of reasons. So, next. And of course, health. And I don't think to really talk too much about this to this audience, because I think a lot of you absolutely recognize the growing body of evidence showing correlations between sedentary lifestyles and suburban development patterns that have led to the increases in obesity, mapped here, and then the consequent increases in diabetes, heart disease, a variety of these chronic diseases. And Dr. Dick Jackson, former director of the National Center for Environmental Health at CDC, likes to shock audiences by saying, heaven forbid that your child should die in a pool of blood. But were that to happen, is it more likely to happen in the city or in the suburbs? And the reality is all of us have grown up with TV cop shows and movies, and we immediately, unfortunately, the image that flashes to mind is sort of, a child killed in a pool of blood must be in a city. No, car crashes are the #1 cause of death for anyone under age 24, and children are much more likely to die in the suburbs. Plus, you get the mental health issues, the isolation, suicide rates, depression rates are highest amongst non-drivers in suburbia, the elderly and kids, teenagers especially. So, all of this is not to say that the suburbs are unhealthy, but just to certainly bring to question just how healthy is this lifestyle that we've most of us have sort of grown up thinking that the suburbs are the healthier place to raise a family. And that's certainly in question now. Poverty is another reason to begin to look at the suburbs. Again, the suburbs have been changing. We tend to think of suburbia as affluent. Today, since 2005, more Americans in poverty are living in suburbs than are living in cities. And they have less access to social services. They have to drive cars to be able to get around, reducing the ability to have funds for other investments. And then there's simply the question of affordability. For generations, I mean, suburbia provided this sort of affordable means for new families to move out. And our model of affordable housing in this country has really been based on drive till you qualify. The cheaper land out at the edge is assumed to have where you'll get more bang for your buck, a bigger house, bigger lot, at a cheaper price. However, in the face of rising gas prices, how sustainable is that model? It's already, data as of 2007 suggests that it depends on your income level and the price of gas, but that after about 10 to 15 miles, the savings associated with the cheaper housing are completely wiped out by the additional cost of transportation. That's at 2007 gas prices. So, none of us know exactly where gas is going, but, it's going to fluctuate. But come on, how many in the room expect gas to go up? It's kind of, so, and it's surprising often to figure out how much money are we really spending. Out of every household is spending on gasoline, on transportation in general. And if I asked any of you, what percent of your income do you spend on housing? You could tell me. It's a fairly easy calculation. But if I ask you, what percent of your income are you spending on transportation? It's hard. There's too many variables. There's the housing, buying a car, fueling a car, insuring a car, maintaining it, if you're paying for parking, all this, in addition to whatever transit you're also covering. So, it turns out that on average, the average household in the U.S. is spending approximately 19% of income on transportation. But that drops down to about 12% if you're living in a walkable neighborhood, and rises to about 25% if you're living in a neighborhood that requires every trip to be by car. And if you're in simply the lower half, take all incomes, divide them in half. If you're in the lower half, chances are you're close to the 30% of income being spent on transportation. And yet none of us do the math. So luckily, there's actually a really terrific website that I took these slides off of, the Housing Plus Transportation Affordability Index, put together by the Center for Neighborhood Technologies. And you can look at any metro area and you can zoom in or zoom out. I just tried to sort of get slides of the general Binghamton area here. And you can query it for a variety of things. So I just looked at, on the left is vehicle miles traveled per household. And on the right is monthly transportation expenses as a percent of income given the 2008 price of gas. And it's pretty shocking to see you guys are in the deep, deep, deep red here, which is at 28% of income going to transportation for the most of your population. The folks living closer in are a little less, but still a very high percentage of income going to transportation. So again, just how affordable is the model of suburbia and auto dependency if gas is going to continue to go up? Next, this I also queried. On the left is average block size, which is a great proxy for just how walkable is an area. So you've got smaller blocks closer in and enormous blocks further out as you get it obviously into more rural areas. And then, but it's interesting to see how much that block size correlates with the amount of CO2 emitted per household. And so again, you see these correlations between how walkable an area is, how much carbon households are tending to disperse. So, for all of these reasons, June and I argue, we've spent most of the last 50 years building suburbia. That has been the big design and development project across the country. And we're arguing that because of all of these unintended negative consequences, the next 50 years, the big project is going to be retrofitting suburbia, making it more sustainable, and most of all, making it more walkable. I mean, that's really one of the biggest. So drawings like these that my new urbanist buddies produce, make it look relatively easy. This is not rocket science. If we start by just building on top of the parking lots, bring in some pedestrian-oriented retail, wider sidewalks, street trees. This is a mix of uses. This is good, basic new urbanist planning. Now, there's a little oops in this case. I don't know how many of you caught it, but they lost the bike lane. Just a graphic error. These are. It's not rocket science. But building on top of the parking lots is a great way to start. However, it's not quite going to be enough. We actually need to fundamentally retrofit the pattern of our roads, our blocks, and our lots to make them more walkable. Suburbia in general, the dendritic road system, doesn't interconnect enough to really get those walkable blocks. So in addition to building on top of the parking lots, we've also got to do a lot of harder work on the infrastructure. Now, luckily, there are several factors in our favor. And one of the biggest ones that's really been pushing these retrofits is a remarkable demographic shift. Now, we all think of suburbia as family-focused. The reality is that's not who actually lives there anymore. Since 2000, 2/3 of suburban households did not have kids in them. Basically, the baby boomers, who were the babies, who suburbia really was built for, they were the boom, they raised their kids in suburbia, the kids have grown, and they're still there. So you've got a lot of empty nesters. Majority of baby boomers are empty nesters now, getting close to retirement, the leading edge. So they're the boomers in the age pyramid here up in the upper right. Then in the middle, you get Gen X. Gen X is in their 40s, they're having lots of kids, they're having kids, but they're a small generation. There aren't enough Gen Xers to fill all the existing single-family homes in this country that the baby boomers will vacate. We have a glut of single-family homes, and it's expected we will not fill those existing single-family homes until through at least 2035. Now that's assuming that people could just roll like marbles across the country and find vacant homes. But still, it's meanwhile, most of our zoning codes. What are most of our zoning codes expecting? Communities that are hoping to grow, what is it they want to see? Is more single-family homes. They're somewhat out of sync. Now, the generation coming up after Gen X are the millennials, or Gen Y. They've just hit 30. Most of them are in their 20s or upper teens. They're a huge generation. They already are in many cases, or they will become the target market, much as the boomers have been. But Gen Y, they're not yet in prime child rearing years. Most of them are expected to delay children for quite a long time. And so the combination of just this demographic situation is that leads demographers to predict that through 2025, 75 to 85% of new households will not have kids in them. We'll still have plenty of families having kids, but not all the new households, kids graduating out of college, second homes as boomers retire. We're looking at a different market. And as then consumer research begins to ask the boomers and Gen Y, the target markets, really, what are you looking for? What would you like to live in? Well, it turns out that both groups, neither one wants to become their parents, and they both are actually looking for more urban lifestyles in suburbia. The boomers, they felt really bad putting mom and dad in the retirement home, sort of over there, and quietly retiring. Demographers sometimes refer to them, the boomers as they hit retirement are going to be the yippies. Youthful, energetic, elderly people into everything. They want to volunteer in lots of activities, they want to be engaged, they want to walk, they want to take transit, and they want to age in place. So they want to stay in the suburbs where they are for the most part, but they don't want to give up the keys, we know that, though they will eventually have to. And so they're looking for more urban opportunities. And similarly, when you ask Gen Y, it's pretty astonishing. I mean, 75% of them grew up in the suburbs. 77% say they want to live in an urban core. They grew up watching Friends and Seinfeld. They want the urban lifestyle, not Leave It to Beaver. And yet, their suburban job growth has outpaced urban job growth by a factor of 6. So most of those young professionals are likely to be working in suburbia. And so again, the combination, they're looking for a more, you put all this together, you come up with, you actually have a very large market that's looking for more urban lifestyles in suburban places. And it's, the number one, in demographics, the number one growing group are single person households. And some of those folks may want a single family home, but not most of them. Another factor that's been really kind of driving a lot of the retrofits that I'm about to show is the simple fact of leapfrog development. I mean, for the last 50 years, our development model has been to just continually leapfrog. When the first suburbs were built, downtown was at their back, and then they were leapfrogged. 5 miles out, another mall comes in, and the original mall begins to lose some of its luster as the shops move out to the newer mall. And we've seen this pattern repeat, and that's essentially been fundamental to sprawl development. So it's taken away market share from a lot of those early suburbs as they've aged, and many of them have gone into decline. But it's been going on for so long now, it's also given them a relatively central location in their metros. And even though the mindset of a lot of those first and early suburbs is, we're suburbs, we're not downtown. Downtown's back behind us, kind of. The fact is they actually now have a relatively central location, and if they so choose, they can choose to make themselves a more urban destination and conceive of themselves, give themselves the downtown they may not have ever had. Also, what this process means is that we have a lot of what developers often refer to as underperforming asphalt. And I like to, really just, underused parking lots. I like to think of it as it's the name of my indie rock band in a parallel universe, because I just think it's a really great band name. But basically, because when the first ring suburbs were built, the land was cheap. It didn't make sense to build parking garages. You build a lot of surface parking lots. But now that they have a relatively central location, in many cases, now it does make sense to go look at those parking lots, build decks, and start building on top of the rest of the parking lots. Start urbanizing them. This image is from Atlanta, where I live. This is Perimeter Center Mall. The name already kind of gets it, the oxymoron of these shifting, changing identities. And anyone who knows Atlanta would thinks of Perimeter Center as, it's totally built out. You can't do anything there. That slide is about 80% surface parking lots. If you think of those surface parking lots as potential building sites, there's enormous potential. And in fact, actually, there's a lot that is happening in Perimeter right now. So what do you do if you if you've got some dead big box, dead mall, dying commercial strip sites. And it turns out people have been coming up with all sorts of really great creative things. So I'm going to talk first about the strategy of reinhabitation, reusing these sites with more community-serving uses. Starting with some really modest ideas. This was in a suburb of Dallas, Oak Cliff. A local civic group decided to stage what they called the Build a Better Block, just a 2-day art installation. They took a block, you can see the lower image, that was completely vacant, didn't have any stores, any operations, operating. And so for 2 days, they brought in trees and planters. They rolled in lights on wheels, street lights on wheels. They filled the stores with activities. They put displays in milk crates. It's just a temporary 2-day thing. But it got the community so jazzed up as to what was possible, and to say, wow, this block should be re-inhabited. We want this. We want this back. We want that now. This was in October 2010. Every single shop is leased. The community, the city council, completely committed to making this live. They're now giving webinars to other communities. There's about 10 other communities that have started Build a Better Blocks. Just with the simple, again, touching the imagination, showing people kind of potential, what's possible. This is an example, also, again, just sort of a modest, but a simple grocery store, a dead grocery store that's been adaptively reused into a public library. It's not fundamentally changing the infrastructure. They did extend the sidewalks to make it that much more connected to some of the neighborhoods kind of behind the strip. They took out a few parking spaces, put in a bioswale to catch the runoff, shown in the lower, catch and clean runoff, shown in the lower image. But most importantly, they took a grocery store along a commercial strip of completely private commercial space, and now they made a public space. And it's going to be really interesting to see if over time, does this seed begin to grow? Are we going to see more public activities and gathering spaces come around? I don't know. I'm eager to watch. This one in Phoenix is a great example of some creative people bought 2 little empty L-shaped strip malls across or next to each other. They've since bought one across the street as well. They put in a lot of bright paint and good food. Never underestimate the power of food to make a place into a destination and make it a sort of cool, fun place. And so it has now become, the local real estate ads all proclaim walking distance to La Grande Orange. Now in Phoenix, to claim walking distance, that's actually a pretty big deal. And they do exaggerate, but the reason is because it's become what sociologists like to refer to as a third place. If home is the first place and work is the second place, the third place is where you go to build community, to hang out, to get to know your neighbors, to relax. And because suburbia has done a wonderful job of focusing the social life on the family, on the privacy of the single-family house and the school. But if now that most households don't have any kids in school, they don't have that social connection anymore, now that you've got a lot of single-person households in suburbia, there's a real desire for more third places. And suburbia in general hasn't really had them. So we're seeing a lot of more places to eat, places like libraries, places to hang out. Another trend in reinhabitation has been, and trend in development in general, but has been what developers call meds and eds. Lots and lots of medical centers, clinics coming in into vacant big box or malls. But also lots of schools, from pre-K, charter schools, all the way up through university level. Loads and loads of examples moving into vacant retail space. This is an example that combines them. This is in Nashville, where a dying two-story mall recently, they renovated their entire second floor, has now become part of Vanderbilt University's medical center, now occupies the second floor. So it's helped bring a new population to the mall, it's reviving the mall, it's providing very accessible space for the medical center, so a real win-win. And other malls have been re-inhabited with all sorts of things. This one outside of St. Louis was again a dying mall. So half the mall is still a mall, but the other half now they've turned into what they call art space. So they've got artists in the inline stores, dance troupes, theater groups. A lot of it is very sort of children-oriented art, because malls tend to be very family-focused. And it's sort of a holding pattern. The owners of the mall hope to redevelop the mall when the economy recovers. But it's rather than letting the mall go dark, this is becoming now a great community resource. They're bringing in the arts. Next. Closer to home here, in Cheektowaga, New York, a mall became a business park. And we've seen lots of examples, again, of just office basically moving in. You'd be amazed the difference. The minute they turn the sort of marble flooring into carpeting, it just transforms these places. So I think, a lot of the re-inhabitations tend to really improve the sort of social sustainability of communities. But if you really are trying to improve the carbon, the environment, and the economic, then you really want to start looking at the redevelopment strategies. Now, one of the oldest of the redevelopment retrofits is this project, Mashpee Commons, out on Cape Cod, where this was a little family-owned strip center. You can see the black and white image, sort of 60s vintage strip center, but that sat on a large site, huge amount of parking. And over the past 20 years, the owners have just started building a little New England village on top of the parking lot. And so that it's now got, they built the first apartments over retail outside of a city in 50 years. 13 apartments over a Talbot's. The bankers told them they were crazy. They have never had a vacancy. And they've told me that actually about 30% over the last 20 years now, that about 30% of the renters have been elderly folks who actually really enjoy the feeling of being, they're in this village. So that was the original 13, but it's grown considerably since. So here's just a map sort of showing the strip center. It's right near a traffic circle, and just a big site with a lot of parking. Next. By 2005, so over the 20 years, they just built a grid, a little grid of walkable streets with, again, a mix of uses. They've got a post office, they've got a church, a number of kind of civic spaces, but a lot of, again, retail at ground level and apartments above. And it's taken a long time, but next, they now have permission to connect that little fragment of their village to 5 more compact residential neighborhoods. And Cape Cod is very, very a slow growth state. They do not want to see density. They're very worried. It's taken a really long time. But Mashpee has, I think, just shown just that kind of incrementally, it's now is the de facto downtown. It really is a very successful project. And a couple of interesting strategies that they've used includes using really skinny little shops that become the liners that screen the parking lot on one hand, so you can sort of see in green in the plan there, and see, but they also become incubators for local retail. the developers knew that they wanted about never more than a 50-50, 50% national retailers. They really wanted to get a lot of local folks in. So they deliberately built buildings that were too small for the national chains. But you have to have a mix to really make it work financially. They actually told me that through the recession, it's been their mom and pop shops that have actually helped them even more than the chains, even though their chain stores were doing quite well, because nationally the chains had to cut back. They were getting kind of less rents in the process. So, next. Now, this is another example of building on top of the parking lots, but this one in an office park. This one's outside of DC, outside of Washington, D.C., in Hyattsville, Maryland. The office park was designed in the 60s by notable Edward Durrell Stone, an architect of the Museum of Modern Art and the Kennedy Center. And it's 3 office buildings with surface parking lots, but when DC extended its transit system out into the suburbs and a new station opened up kind of kitty corner to the site, the owner said, gee, those surface parking lots don't make any sense anymore. So he built a parking deck, kind of tucked it under the hill, and has inserted a new main street in between the office buildings, along with several new housing buildings. So next. So here you can see the site. It was a farm in the village of Hyattsville, Maryland, back in 1940. Next. By 1980, a highway had come in, as well as the office park, or the 3 rectangles, and then a mall, and then there's some garden apartments, sort of 3-story apartments to the north and west of the mall. Next. So when we went to press with our book, and when we did this drawing in 2008, this was what showing that this was where we thought the project was. And so that shows the insertion of the new main street in between the office buildings, and a lot of a mix of uses, several residential, while the office buildings continued to function, and nothing's getting torn down, it's just all adding stuff. But you can see the transit has come in. But we've actually, this past summer, we had to update this map because the fact that the success of the infill of the office park has now also got the owners of the mall thinking that they are already talking about expanding the street grid across the mall and redeveloping the mall site. The garden apartments just to the north of the mall have already received permission to redevelop. They're going up to 30-story, going from 3-story to 30, because they're right next to transit. Now, DC is a very strong market. They haven't really had a recession. They have so much government work. So DC's really doing well. But I think DC can sort of shows us how one retrofit can lead to another. I mean, we're sort of seeing this whole area now becoming a very urban, transit-related, walkable neighborhood out of what really was a sea of parking, and kind of suburban, very typical suburban patterns. This shows a little bit of what the project looks like. So on the upper right, you see the sort of curved, funky condo building, some new public space, and then the older office building right behind. Lower right, you see the new main street, again with the existing office building right behind. And I love what the new main street is adding to the place by adding a lot of walkable retail, a lot of restaurants. But architecturally, it really, as an architect, it just makes me wince. I think they used kind of suburban-styled strip architecture to make a main street, and it's just, lost opportunity. On the right, on the left, you can see some of the new, really affordable housing types that have been brought into this area. The Towers is actually apartments that are 4-bedroom, 4-bath. They're really designed like dorm rooms, designed for the groups, to encourage more very affordable housing in this project. So you get a mix of both, the student and us. Now, dead malls are really where you see the redevelopment strategies. In many respects, you really see the greatest impacts, I think. This is one of my favorites. Belmar is outside of Denver, and in the town of Lakewood. It's what was a 100-acre super block site with a really big mall. Today, it's 22 walkable blocks with public streets and all green construction, a huge array of photovoltaics. They do have a few surface parking lots, but they've turned them into wind farms by putting wind turbines on the light standards. A real mix of housing types. It's quite a remarkable project. Next. So here's what the site looked like in its heyday as the mall. This was the de facto downtown for Lakewood. They held their prom at the mall. It was, that they loved it. And then this is probably taken on the day after Thanksgiving. Next. So here's the mall in 1975. Next. By 1995, the mall has died. The department store has been retained. We found this to be very common. Department stores tend to be multi-story, better construction, easy to adaptively reuse. But the single-story stuff, the systems are shot, and you really, often they're just getting demolished. Next. And here's the expected build-out. It's really got fantastic connectivity, lots of walkability, and again, it doesn't feel all cookie-cutter. There's really a lot of different kinds of housing. It's not quite as it goes from sort of middle to expensive. I wish there was a little more on the really affordable side, and it's the one thing I would critique this project for. But 8 bus lanes come through the project, has a major green space, a major hardscape public space. Next. And this is what it looks like. This is not high-rise urbanism. This is sort of small, a new version of a small town. They basically tripled density on the site, but did not have to add a single new traffic light, because 45% of the trips of the people living there now are being captured internally, because they can walk to things. So it's, and we found this to be very true in a lot of the retrofits. Next. So you can see some of the range of spaces, the strategies. They do have still a big parking garage and a big cinemaplex, but they've lined the cinemaplex with smaller boutique shops. They lined the edge of the parking garage with artist studios that are glass and visible, so very interesting to walk by. The museum, local museum, Denver Museum, opened a cultural sort of space. So, a lot of things to really make this a very real place. And one of the things that is sort of been driving a lot of this is our interesting study, the benefits of mixed uses. And there's been some studies recently Joe Minicozzi has done looking at, most suburban communities tend to think they live and die on sales tax, and they've got to get that mall and the Walmart and those big sales tax ratables. But in most communities, most of that sales tax goes to the state. Only actually a small part remains with the municipality, whereas property tax does remain with the municipality. So what Joe Minicozzi began doing was looking at, on a per acre basis, property tax on a per acre basis, and comparing that retail versus mixed use. And what you start to see are startling numbers. Now, of course, there's also costs associated with having residents as opposed to just having a Walmart or a mall. But especially for older communities that may be somewhat built out, it's really worth looking at. Your property tax on a per acre basis versus sales tax. And these are just some of the kinds of figures to compare. Next. This map shows Belmar as the red star in relation to Denver in the center. And you can see it also shows the 13 other malls in the Denver area. 8 of the 13 have or have announced plans to be retrofitted. I mean, whereas in DC, transit has been the driver, in Denver, it's been the dead malls. And the public sector and the private sector have sort of gotten their act together. They've figured out how to do this. Now, these deals are complex public-private deals in every case. No 2 deals are exactly the same. But it's still pretty remarkable to see what's possible. What's also useful about this slide, I think, is to see that it's not as if no neighborhoods were bulldozed, only underperforming mall sites. So this is not diminishing the choices. It's not taking away anybody's single-family home. Those are all still there. It's providing more choices for that new demographic that are looking for more urban lifestyles, but within suburban areas. But it does also raise the question, okay, so we're providing these pockets of walkability. Well, that's nice for a few people get to walk a little bit, but is that to really get systemic impacts? How do we connect the dots? And to do that, we need to start retrofitting the corridors themselves and the infrastructure. So some of these corridor retrofits can be quite modest. Here in Washington, D.C., is an example where the D.C. planners looked at this intersection with these really wide turning radii, huge slip lanes, big traffic islands, and said, it's not very walkable, and it happens to be there's a metro stop just off the slide, but it's very close to a metro stop. So they said, all right, we're going to pay for rebuilding the intersection of the road as a 90-degree intersection with walkable, easily crossable streets, and that's going to free up these traffic islands that are public property, and we're going to, in essence, we're going to give a 100-year lease to developers to build, we'll give it essentially for free, if they'll build the kind of walkable, mixed-use, compact development that we'd like to see. And the reason why, part of what's driving this kind of planning, and we're seeing a lot of communities are doing this, sort of really looking at the public land, discovering developable public land, so as a way that the public sector can incentivize some of this. But it's also because of the release last year of a new manual, the cover is shown there on the lower left, Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares. That is a new recommended practice by the Institute of Transportation Engineers, developed with the Congress for the New Urbanism, that for the first time, engineers now have a manual that does not refer to sidewalks as vehicle recovery zones or trees as fixed hazardous objects. It's written from the point of view of the pedestrian as well as the driver, and not only from the driver. We're also seeing a lot of corridor examples, really doing interesting things. This is an example in Northern Virginia. They took a 5-mile commercial strip and upzoned at 4 major intersections. And the upzoning, then the additional tax revenue from the higher density buildings at those intersections is then to support a streetcar. Because we've already seen that how transit can induce densification. Now we're trying to see, can coding induce densification and then support the transit afterwards? And it's moving ahead remarkably fast. They've actually extended the project, very tightly used. The form-based code allows up to 10 stories right along the intersection and then tapers it down to 3 stories within a single block in terms of how it meets the neighborhoods. And the neighbors, it also deliberately does not extend along the whole corridor because they're preserving the apartment buildings in between the intersections, which are the affordable housing. So you're seeing a really great combination of strategies working out on this one. Next. We're also seeing a lot of these drawings of folks proposing that we take our commercial corridors and turn them into boulevards. And this is one of the first ones that has actually been built in Cathedral City, California. You can see the black and white images show the before condition. This is not a place anyone would want to choose to live. But now that they've gone back, the city took control of it was a state highway, it's now owned by the city wants this to turn it back into their main street, so they built a multi-way boulevard with the high-speed traffic in the middle, side lanes for parking, for transit, and for access to shops. But they put in all those trees, and the trees now make this a grand address. You can imagine, grand apartment buildings along there. And I think as as a solution to the alternative to drive till you qualify, if we could get more affordable housing built on transit-served boulevards that were attractive, safe, beautiful places to live, now it's expensive, but it's really the only alternative I see systemically to drive till you qualify. Next. Now, raising the bar on the on corridor retrofits, we need to look to the Canadians. They're now, in addition to integrating land use and transportation, they're also throwing energy into the mix. This is Cambie Corridor in Vancouver, where, because of the Olympics, they already put in a rail line along a commercial strip, and they've changed their zoning, but they're also now incorporating a district energy system. District energy means that instead of each building having its own boiler and cooling, you have system-wide campuses. University campuses have done this for a long time. But when you see a corridor that's going from single-use to multi-use, you can begin to balance out the daytime commercial use loads with nighttime residential loads. You get much greater efficiencies. And so it's a really interesting example. They're also, I think, doing some great work in their architecture. The lower left there is a Home Depot that is lined with boutique retail as it meets the sidewalk of a busy street next to a transit station, and affordable housing built above it. And when Home Depot tells you they won't do this, they did it in Vancouver. So did Whole Foods, integrated themselves in with office building up above. But all that densification won't work everywhere. There has to be a market, and a lot of times it makes more sense to simply re-green these properties. So there's a burgeoning suburban farming movement. A lot of people really, interested in organic foods and using their own property to begin to do so. This is a mall in Cleveland that the owner of the mall recognized that, that big skylight in the atrium, it's kind of like a greenhouse. So while the mall is open, they've planted raised beds and are growing organic veggies right down the center of the atrium, and they've repositioned their food court to be all healthy food. And, again, it's creative thinking. And Detroit is certainly considering massive scale farming. Cleveland also has a lot of vacant lots, and they've come up with a very useful pattern book. This is just slides from one page of some of the suggestions of sort of letting the community know ways they can use their vacant lots, in this case either for rain gardens or geothermal wells, and and really giving a sort of how-to for a lot of this. And sometimes it's entire properties. Really, it makes sense to reconstruct the wetlands. This is a strip shopping center outside of St. Paul that had been built on top of a wetland, which was very common before the Clean Water Act. And as when the strip mall failed, you can see in the middle image here, the parking lot was already starting to perk because the culverts had failed. So they actually said, all right, we're giving up. They reconstructed the wetlands. It was on a major migratory bird route. And that was really the whole point of the project. But in the process, they created lakefront property and attracted the first new private development to a very low-income neighborhood in over 40 years. So the regreening can actually also often have terrific economic benefits as well, turning underperforming properties into parks. Parks tend to improve adjacent property values from 20 to 35%. That's what, Columbus, Ohio, is counting on. This was actually a mall in their downtown, but again, a suburban property type. The mall had failed. They tore down the mall last summer, and last fall they opened up a new park on the site, and they're hoping to, when the economy recovers, ring the park with urban housing. But again, using the park as a way to actually improve property values. And this is also an example, again, of the ability, the need for really improving the local ecology as we do things. This is a mall outside of Seattle that the mall's doing very well. They wanted to expand, but they had to make a deal with the local environmentalists who were still mad at them because they had culverted a major stream under their huge parking lot. So in order to expand, The mall had to then pay for daylighting that creek, putting in a very extensive bioswale that now captures runoff from 600 acres, but that bioswale is now treated as an amenity, so in the aerial view you can see senior housing in the foreground, the bioswale under construction really being treated as a park, and then mixed-use housing behind it. Next. So you can sort of see here, again, this, the cleaning of the runoff becoming an amenity for residents. And again, using parks for that. So what are these places actually like? As an architect, I'm very sensitive to the fact that a lot of these retrofits are often accused of being sort of phony, kind of fake. They feel like instant urbanism. This is a photograph of a protest taking place on the AstroTurf Town Green at Silver Spring, Maryland. Now, it doesn't get much more fake or phony than an AstroTurf Town Green. But, and so I do wince, at some of the material choices on this stuff. But the fact is, this is democracy in action. The fact that they got the infrastructure right, they made a pattern of blocks, lots, and streets that meant there was a public space that they knew, here's where we have to hold the protest. I mean, that's the sort of sine qua non of urbanism. But it does point to how hybrid these places are. They're public spaces, but often sort of in quotes. They're often under private management. They have urban streetscapes, but suburban parking ratios. Urban qualities, but often at suburban costs, which usually means cheaper. Makes me wince a little. Populations that are more diverse than typical suburbs, but less diverse than typical cities, and they are instant urbanism. So next. So I think the challenges as we go ahead, though, the reality is they are kind of fake and phony, but when you don't have the infrastructure in place, as when we don't in suburbia, you really need to kind of redevelop in big chunks. It's one thing, we need to do the incremental build on the parking lots, but we also need to really knit all this together with major infrastructure investments. So next. Our challenges as we go ahead are to raise the bar on the architectural quality. Again, the Canadians are doing some really amazing retrofits. I think we also need the challenges to think bigger. Think at the regional and the metro scale. All the projects that I've shown happened because one developer, one town, they were able to make a deal. But we need to now start thinking about looking at our regions as a whole and saying, do a gray field audit. Where are all our vacant properties? Which should we target for regreening because we never should have built there in the first place? Where's the transit and the employment, and we need to target those for redevelopment? And then where do we want to encourage re-inhabitation so that we have some cheap space for the nonprofits, the low profits, the mom and pops? This is an image from a recent competition for Long Island called the Build a Better Burb Ideas Competition. And this was the People's Choice winner. There was a vision, radical vision of sort of looking at Long Island and saying we ought to have urban growth boundaries around all the existing train stations and downtowns, and then really farm in between, preserve and keep real farmland in between. Next. And we need to think about the foreclosure fringes as we look at that regional planning. Most of the projects I showed were in the first ring suburbs, but now with the foreclosure crisis out at the edges, we need new ideas, and nobody really yet knows quite what to do. Next. So there's a lot of public sector incentives that we really, I think, need to, the public sector has a lot that it can do to really help advance retrofits. And I'm not going to get into these, I've run out of time, but public-private partnerships are a big one, obviously. Zoning and regulatory reform are essential. Next. Lots of state policies are happening in various places, doing all sorts of great things. New York's got the Smart Growth Bill. You guys should build on it, but there are also other things to learn from other states. And I'll make all these slides available. I'm sorry, I knew I was packing a little too much in here. And there are some new tools, lots of new tools out there. And we need the new technology. The straddle bus, the Schweeb, we need new ideas. We can really reimagine. The Schweeb is an inverted human-powered bicycle monorail track system. They just won $1 million from Google to try to put these into office parks. And the Beijing is building the straddle bus, two-story bus that rides above the traffic. So lots and lots of interesting things. We need to build our public spaces, not just rely on retail, play, sport, all sorts of fun things. Last, additional resources. And again, I'll make all this available, but there really are some great resources. And the final slide is a plug for Come to Madison, Wisconsin in June. The Congress for New Urbanism is going to have a whole bunch of sessions on suburban retrofitting and on downtown redevelopment. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Ellen, just exceptional. I want to ride the Schweeb and the straddle bus. I want a free pass. We are running into break time, but we did want to give Ellen an opportunity to answer any questions that anybody may have in the audience. I'm going to come over with the microphone, and Ellen.
Have you found that tax increment financing in areas that have effective TIF programs are helpful in providing funding for infrastructure improvements and the other things that you're talking about? We're trying to get effective TIF legislation in New York State, and hopefully this year will be the year.
Absolutely. Most of the projects, I'd say, have TIF funding, and there are some, I haven't yet to see a real case of TIF failure, which I've been curious with the foreclosure crisis. I have not yet found any. But I think there certainly are concerns about capping limits of what percent of an area's, just how many taxes you want to put into play. But absolutely, I would say most of these projects have been engaged with TIF funding, but they're all constructed somewhat differently. I know California right now is actually considering, the governor has proposed defunding all of the current redevelopment authorities, but he wants to refund them, but limit them to only doing redevelopment that is transit-oriented related. And so there are ways to, I think there's a lot of things happening nationwide on sort of where the TIF funding, but I would certainly recommend looking at it. I mean, I think it's a great tool.
Hi. Last month I was at a local government training session, and there was a panel called Dealing with Entrenched Mentalities. And I guess my question, I know it's hard to generalize, what do you think are some of the factors that allow communities to be somewhat more proactive rather than waiting for complete disaster?
It's a great question. And on the one hand, I would actually say, the easiest retrofits are a dead mall, because it's so visible, and you get the neighbors that normally might have a NIMBY response, not in my backyard. If there's a dead mall next to their neighborhood, they're going to be pounding on the planners' doors. Give me something else. What have you got? We'll take anything. I'm exaggerating, but whereas if it's simply a dying property, but not completely dead, not to the point where it's bringing down its neighbors, that's often harder to really incentivize or bring about the change. I think it really takes strong local leadership, and it's usually almost all of the stories. June and I visited all of these projects. We talked with local people, and always, over and over, it comes down to someone had a vision, someone really started talking to people. Yes, there's a lot you can do to incentivize, but it still always comes down to getting enough people who are willing to really talk about this and make it personal. Often the success stories come when someone realizes a lot of people want to protect their neighborhoods. They don't want to see change. They're very scared of change. And they want their neighborhood to grow just like it was when they moved in. And getting people to recognize that the demographics have changed is one of the biggest problems. And I think that's where you start asking them, do your kids want to live here? And if they start to say, no, my kids really don't want to live here, then you say, all right, how do we change this to make this a place your kids want to live? And that's, I think, often where you start to see communities that have been more successful at change.
I'd like to ask about the more systemic changes that you alluded to.
I'm sorry?
The more systemic changes, both in terms of scaling up to the regional level and terms of re-engineering the infrastructure, the road networks. Many of the examples that you showed seem to me to continue the sort of Cartesian difference between residential areas and mixed use or commercial areas. So we're still left with the problem of where do folks go to get a gallon of milk? They still need to drive in many cases. And so how do we incorporate mixed use areas that are smaller in scale into existing residential neighborhoods, especially when we're having the problems that you just talked about, of folks not wanting change?
I mean, I think the reality is, in the long term, I mean, I did a plan led a team at Georgia Tech. We were asked to look at Atlanta 100 years from now. So with that long a framework, we were willing to say that, all right, in 100 years, anybody who lives subdivisions that are too far from transit or too close to water, so oil and water being the finite resource limits. In 100 years, those subdivisions they'll be too expensive. They won't be viable, is what we argued. And but in the short term, so in the long term, we argued you're going to have to use transfer of development rights to the transit corridors, and we had our sort of vision of that. But in the short term, when you already have a lot of sprawl, the only way to really reduce dependency is to set up more multiple centers, multiple nodes. But you're only reducing driving. You're not getting rid of driving. And I don't see us really, I think, fighting the fight to try to change a lot of existing neighborhood structures is so difficult that when we already have so much commercial land that is available for redevelopment, I don't think it makes sense. I think it's a much easier political win to focus on the commercial land and let the existing neighborhoods evolve as they will, because I don't think you can fight it very successfully.
Ellen's presentation was just so inspirational, and there's a lot of activity already going on in our region with the retrofitting theme. If you think about the Vestal Strip Mall that was redeveloped by the Newman Corporation and the student housing that is there now, it is buzzing. We were just there last night, and that's what we see in our future here, is really taking what we have existing in our community and making it work. So Ellen, thank you for your vision and your inspiration. Okay, on to our next speaker, Mr. Matthew Lister, who is going to be talking about repairing the fabric of communities, green urban solutions, which talks about location efficiency, and where you build really does have a big impact on your health and on the environment, and he's going to give us ideas on how to do this. Mr. Lister brings to his role as project manager in the Jonathan Rose Company's planning practice a wide range of experience in architectural design, planning, and project management. Trained as an architect, Mr. Lister has gained an experience in planning, design, entitlements, finance, and construction for a wide variety of architectural and urban design projects throughout the United States. Mr. Lister currently teaches graduate-level planning at the Pratt Institute in New York City and has taught both undergraduate and graduate-level classes at the University of Miami School of Architecture. Mr. Lister has a Master of Science in Real Estate Development from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a Master of Architecture and a Master of Suburb and Town Design from the University of Miami School of Architecture. He holds a Bachelor of Arts and Humanities from the University of Colorado. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Matthew Lister.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Matthew Lister. I work for Jonathan Rose Companies. We are a multidisciplinary real estate development and planning firm that's based in New York City. I've always been told that it's not a very good idea to come up and speak after somebody who essentially says everything that you're going to say, but better and funnier. So thanks, Ellen. I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few things. About a year and a half ago, we Jonathan Rose Companies worked with the EPA on this paper, Location Efficiency and Housing Type, boiling it down to BTUs. And just a word of caution, this is one of those examples of where sometimes you say something as a joke and then all of a sudden it actually makes it into the report. So he said, what if we called it boiling it down to BTUs? Wouldn't that be funny? Haha, and now it's out there. So they asked us to look at the relationships between house type and location and the impact on household energy consumption. And so today I'd like to talk a little bit about what we found and how we think it impacts the way people live, but also how it informs and influences the work that we do as a company. So next slide. So as I said before, we studied 3 different house types, which I'll go through in a minute, and we compared the household energy consumption for each house type, and we placed them in transit-oriented development locations and what we're calling conventional suburban development. And I'll get back to what all of this means in just a minute. But first, next slide. I just want to kind of go through what the house types are. And the first one is single-family detached. We all know what this looks like. It looks like more or less like this across the country. Obviously, there are different stylistic differences, and the shapes and sizes of these things change. But for the most part, they have 4 walls on either side. They're not connected to anybody else. And as Ellen mentioned, this has a lot to do with the efficiency of the house. It is also probably one of the predominant forms of housing development throughout the country. Next type. These are single-family attached homes, or as we like to say, row houses or townhouses. They can look very traditional or very modern, depending on what you like or where you are. They tend to be a little bit more efficient because they're sharing walls. Next. And then multifamily, which is essentially condos and apartment buildings, right? And you can find these types of buildings out in suburban environments and also in urban environments, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide. So we took each of those house types and we placed them into two generally different locations, right? And the first one is conventional suburban development, which Ellen talked about and explained very well, and then the second is transit-oriented development. Next slide. And the critical difference between those two as far as this research is concerned is that conventional suburban development you can only move around in this development pattern using the automobile. And in transit-oriented development, you have the option to use transit. Right? So next slide. So we went back to our labs and we did a lot of really very complicated calculations. We added using very general national averages, we added the household energy consumption of each house type to transportation costs for the automobile and for transit, and we ended up with, next slide, this. And not surprisingly, if you live in a single-family detached house and you rely only on the automobile to move around, you use a lot more energy than if you live in a multifamily house and use transit to get around, right? And so there's several stories in this slide. One is that the type of house that you live in makes a difference in terms of household energy consumption, but more significantly than that, though, is the location, right? So if you see a single-family detached house that has 240 million BTUs annually, if you're living in a transit-oriented development location, which means you're probably using transit to get to and from work, but you might use the car on the weekends and or in the evenings to go to and from the grocery store, you're going to use a lot less energy. And then we added a third layer to this, which is what if you applied green building technologies like Energy Star technologies to the home and then used a Prius. And what we found is that it does make a significant difference, but even with all of the green technology, it still isn't as significant as the location, right? And so this is really important. So next slide. So why does this matter? Next slide. So the big picture stuff is, this is bad for the environment for us to use all this energy, global climate change, bad air quality. The other big picture is that it increases our dependency on foreign oil, right? But we actually think that these are incredibly huge, important issues, but these are not the issues that actually make people decide where they want to live, right? I don't make a decision to move to a neighborhood because I want to reduce our nation's dependency on foreign oil. And I don't really make a decision about the neighborhood that I want to live in based on my concern for the environment, right? There are a lot more factors that go into this. So, next slide. So we have this idea that everybody would know their BTU number, right? That we could run around and say, I'm BTU 240 and I'm BTU 170 and I'm BTU 95 and I'm better than you and whatever. So, but then we realized that's ridiculous. Like, what, British thermal units? That just really has no bearing whatsoever on the way people live and the things that they find important. Next slide. But there is a truth to it, though, right? That we all sort of do have a BTU number, and that we all the decisions that we make about where we live have an impact on the way we consume energy. Next slide. So people that live in an urban environment and walk a lot and don't use a car have lower numbers than those that have to drive on the freeway, right? So, but more important than the bigger issues actually are these personal issues. And again, these are the reasons why I got into what we do, and these are the reasons that drive the kind of development that we do as a company. And there's sort of three big things, I think. One is resiliency and stability. The second is choice, having the choice to live in a location that meets the needs of your lifestyle. And the third is quality of life, right? And so embedded in this very sort of blunt instrument to tell us about location and housing are these much deeper issues. Next slide. And so what we realize is that what this really represents is that where people live really affects how they live and vice versa, right? So next slide. So when we realized that, we decided that we would stop looking at these numbers and that we would actually stop looking at the house types and we would actually stop looking at urbanism, and we wanted to just spend a little bit of time kind of diving into what does this mean, like in a in your day-to-day life? What does location efficiency mean, right? And so we've created these composites, these people, and sort of tracked them through their daily life. And just as a personal aside, I've personally lived in each and every one of the scenarios that we're going to look at. I grew up in Peoria, Illinois, in a single-family house in the suburbs, and I moved to Colorado and got a little more urban, just a tiny bit. And then I moved to Miami and got a lot less urban and drove around everywhere. And then I moved to Washington, D.C. and got a lot more urban, and then sort of made my way up the Eastern Seaboard. And my wife and I now live in New York City, and so we've kind of gone full spectrum from suburban to urban. So I feel a personal connection to all of these stories, right? So this is Dave, right? Next. Dave lives in Milton, Georgia, and he works in Atlanta, Georgia. Next. And this is Dave's neighborhood, right? So Dave lives in conventional suburban development. Next slide. Dave lives in a beautiful home. It's a 4,000 square foot home. He's probably worked very hard and loves the privacy that this home offers him. And I imagine it has granite countertops, and probably a bonus room, which is a lot more room than I have right now, but that's great. Next slide. So this is Dave's car. We actually went back and forth in the office about this because I thought Dave would really probably be more interested in a convertible or something like that. But everyone overrode me and said that Dave is far more sensible and has a family, so he drives this. And it gets 20 miles per gallon. Next slide. So this is a day in the life of Dave, right? And so Dave wakes up, gets in his car, drives 5 miles from home to Starbucks, right? Gets to Starbucks, turns the radio on for the 42-mile drive into the city, to his office, to his place of work. And then after work, he gets in his car again and drives to the gym. And Dave really needs to go to the gym because Dave doesn't walk anywhere, right? And he spends quite a bit of time in the car. After the gym, he goes to the grocery store to pick up whatever he needs, probably once a week because you don't want to be doing that all the time, and then from the grocery store to home. So Dave's day is 90 miles, and he spends 100 minutes in the car. And if you don't think that that has an impact on how you live, you need to look at that number again, 100 minutes. That's a lot of time spent in the car. That's a lot of time not being able to be with your family, not be with your family, watch a baseball game, basically do anything but sit in the car. Next. So then we started to, so this is Dave's profile, right? His BTU profile. So his BTU score is 240. The amount he spends on energy per year, given this, is $5,595, right? He uses 132 million BTUs per year on home energy use and 108 million BTUs per year on transportation use. So then we decided to look a little further and look at these and look at the other house types and other profiles. Next slide. So then we have Sean and Patty, and Sean and Patty also live in a single-family detached house, very similar to Dave's. It might be a little bit smaller because they're in a transit-oriented development location, and so the houses are a little closer together and they're a little more compact. And Sean and Patty actually have the ability to ride transit to work, and so they're spending a lot less time in the car. As they ride the train, they probably have a little bit more time to, like read the paper, maybe talk to one another if that's what they like to do, I don't know. But you can see that their BTU score is much, much lower, and the amount that they spend on energy per year is quite a bit lower too, 3,558. Next slide. So then we get into single family attached, right? And so Judy and Susie live in a townhome. It's probably, it's in a suburban environment. There is no transit, so again, Judy spends a lot of time in her car, unfortunately for Susie. And despite the fact that they have a more efficient home, right, because they have shared walls and there are inherent efficiencies in shared walls, she still spends over $5,000 a year on home energy, or on home and transportation energy consumption. Next slide. But then with the same house type in a transit-oriented development location, Adam spends far less, $2,751, right? Because he's not spending so much time in the car. Next slide. And then we look at Henrietta and Jose, which is our retired couple. They live in a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs. Again, I think they probably have granite countertops as well. But they have a very high BTU score as well, because despite the fact that they live in a very, in an efficient multifamily building, they're still driving everywhere, and they're still completely and totally locked into their car. Next slide. So then we end up with Karen, and so we decided to take Karen a little bit. We decided to go through the actual full exercise with Karen. So next slide. So Karen lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Or I'm sorry, she lives in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and she works in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it's about 6 miles between, right? So she's not walking to work, right? Next slide. This is Karen's home. I think her countertops are Formica. I'm not sure about that, but it's a multifamily building, very hip, cool, right, for Karen. Next slide. This is Karen's car. She actually doesn't have to use it that much, though, because, next slide, she could take light rail to work, right? And so, next slide, when you combine, the ability to take light rail to work with the kinds of locations that she's living and working in, she has a totally different profile than Dave or any of the others, right? So Karen's profile is home to cafe, 0.05 miles. It's essentially across the street, right? The cafe to the train is 1/10 of a mile. She takes the train to the office, that's 6 miles. Office to the gym, 0.05 miles. Gym to the train, 1. Train to the grocery store, another 6, but it's all on the train. And then finally, grocery store to home, 1/10 of a mile. So, but what this illustrates is that compact transit-oriented development allows Karen to meet all of her needs, her daily life needs, around this transit node, right? She can actually do all of this by walking, and then that node is connected by transit to her work node. And so all of her needs are actually met in a walkable environment, right? Next slide. And so her BTU score is significantly lower, right? And the amount of money she spends on energy a year is much, much lower at $2,000. Next slide. So then we started to ask questions about, and this gets into the idea about resiliency. You know, how do rising energy costs affect us? Next slide. So if we, just for example, decided that energy costs were to increase by 20%, next slide. What you find, you know, this is simple math. If you are, the people that are using a lot more energy right now and by virtue of the fact that, and by virtue of their home and location are required to use that amount of energy, as energy increases, they are far more susceptible to the impacts of an increase in energy, right? So Karen has an increase in energy costs of only $425, where Dave is over $1,100 a year. Next slide. So we need to look into the future a bit and try and understand a little bit more about why that's important. Next slide. So this is actually, I'm just going to reiterate something that Ellen said, which is that, next slide, that we have a huge demographic shift that's happening over the course of the next 10 to 20 years. The largest cohort, demographic cohort in the country is the baby boomers, which is people like Dave, right? And so, and then the second largest, which they call an echo boom, is the millennials, right? Next slide. And so Dave is in this big cohort, and then Karen is sort of behind in this second larger but still large cohort of people. And what this means, though, is that you're going to have a huge, significant population that moves from working into retirement, right? And that a large section of that population is actually going to be, as they move into retirement, will be far more susceptible to energy increases, because as they move into retirement, they'll be on a fixed income, for example. And so a 20% increase in their energy costs for lots of these people will be the difference between making it and not making it, right? And so, that's part of the resiliency thing. And then the next part of this is that, as Ellen said, that both of these cohorts actually represent a large new market for transit-oriented development. That people like Dave are going to be aging actively. They're going to be looking for environments that are not isolating like conventional suburban development is. They're also, despite the fact that they're hanging onto their keys, they are not going to want to be, at a certain point, you can't drive anymore. And if you're sitting in a home in the suburbs and you can't drive anymore, then your life is over, essentially, right? You rely on everyone else to try and for your daily needs, right? And so if you're within a walkable environment, you can extend that time that you are independent, right? And then Karen, I mean, the thing about Karen and the millennials, as Ellen said, is that they're actually hungry for the culture and the choices and the options that transit-oriented development, compact mixed-use urbanism will provide. So next slide. So the point is that it's not just about money, actually. That money is important, but the really important thing is that the benefits that come from transit-oriented development are those things that will allow people the opportunity to fulfill their lifestyle, right? And fulfill their lifestyle needs. So, and the reason that this can happen is that transit-oriented development is, as we've seen, is compact, it's very well connected, it's walkable, it's integrated with transit, it's mixed use, and it provides, and it allows for a mix of incomes, right? Next slide. And why that's important is because, when we talk about factors that influence the quality of a person's life, it's these things, right? It's not really street width or, so a lot of the things that we talk about as architects and urban designers, it's these things, right? It's being able to stay active and healthy. It's having access to education, which can provide you with opportunity. It's finding places that are very energetic, but also finding places that allow you to feel calm. It's being part of a community. It's having access to fun and entertainment, and again, as Ellen said, food, right? Food is very important. It's having a mix of incomes so that you have the opportunity to engage within the community, right? That there is an affordability to the market so that any one of us could actually be a part of that place. And I think really most importantly is offering people as many choices as possible, right? So I'm not particularly advocating that Dave is wrong or that Karen is right. What I'm advocating is that we need to have many, many, many more choices for people so that Karen or Dave can make the decision to live in one place or another, right? Next. So one more quick profile. So this is Erica and Matt. My wife will kill me. Next slide. So this is their home. Next slide. It's about the size of a shoebox, right? Next slide. But it's just steps away from the dry cleaner. I live across the street from a grocery store, which is, by the way, this is probably the most significant improvement in my quality of life that I've ever experienced, ever, right? Because it's just incredible to be able to be cooking something, right? And then you're like, oh no, I forgot the cinnamon. And then just walk out the door and get this. That's my pantry. It's just fantastic. So the pharmacy is just around the corner. There's more restaurants than I can possibly imagine just around the corner. I'm a planner, so I don't go to them that often, but it just makes me feel better to walk past them, to know that they're there, and that to tell people that I live near them. There's a bakery there. I'm like 4 blocks away from the subway and 4 stops away from work. So if you did my BTU profile, it would be practically nothing. I spend like maybe 6% of my income on transit. But again, this is all, the point that I'm trying to make with this is that this is the choice that Erica and I made, right? And we're lucky that we were able to make this choice. And it really, honestly, it had nothing to do with, we didn't go, we had to live here because we want to reduce our dependency on foreign oil. Or we want to make a conscious decision to live in a place that will help us mitigate the effects of global climate change. And we are willing to live in 340 square feet to do that. No, I mean, this is about lifestyle, right? And it's about offering people the chance to take part in this. Next slide. So fundamentally, I think this is about how it affects our work and how I think it affects all the things that we're all thinking about going forward. Is that the important thing about the BTU slide is that we have to increase opportunities for people to choose places that can offer all of this, right? That can offer activity and health and energy and calm and education and opportunity and access and affordability and food and fun and entertainment. And that those are the places that, Karen wants to live in, right? And those are the places that Dave probably will want to live in, because I imagine after, 10 more years, he's going to get tired of mowing that lawn, and he'll be much more interested in, I don't know, maybe seeing a show. So, next slide. So what that really means is that we have to get really serious about planning for, supporting, and developing more places like this, right? Next slide. So that sort of, all of this is the sort of big picture story that informs the way that Jonathan Rose Companies works and the way that we've actually set up the company, which is we have 4 practice areas. One is planning, and that's where I'm from. That's what I do. The second one is civic development, and civic development was set up basically as an owner's representation group to help cities and municipalities and nonprofits develop and build the cultural facilities, the libraries, the ballets, the schools, basically those facilities that enrich a place and make it a more interesting place to be in, because we feel that cities actually have to have all of these pieces, that it's not just about housing and transportation, that it's not just about the grocery store, but it's also about enriching people's lives through culture and through learning. Jonathan actually calls this the sort of software of a place. So that's civic development. And then development, our development group develops affordable housing primarily from the ground up. And we do that in kind of all over the country. We've done that in Stamford, Connecticut, and I'm going to show you a project from there, Albuquerque, New York City, and Denver, Colorado. And then the investment group kind of puts our money where our mouth is when it comes to smart growth. They've raised, I think, one of the first smart growth investment funds ever. And what they do is they find those really sort of unique core properties that are a little bit underperforming in cities in the country that have transit or have decided to invest in transit. And so, you know, if you walk through some of this is the Vance building, it's actually in Seattle. And if you walk through some of these cities, you know, we all see these buildings, you go, God, it's such a beautiful old building. It's totally empty. What's wrong? You know, what's happening here? And so we actually see that as an opportunity to come in and redevelop the property. And what we do is we use old school real estate investing principles, right? So before 20 years ago, people used to invest in real estate for a long-term hold. The money was not about, the money that you earned or the return that you earned was not about development and then sell off, right? It was about develop something for the long term, hold it for the long term, and a real estate investment provided a very stable, you know, a decent return, but a stable long-term return, right? Which is, you know, I think, by the way, we're probably going to return to that right now because we've seen over the last several years that the other model, you know, of blow and go development is actually a little bit bankrupt, right? So the Vance building we purchased several years ago, and because we want to build these things, we want to develop these things for the long term. The significant thing is that we green the building, right? And what that does from an economic perspective is just lower operating expenses for the long term, which obviously would improve your return over the long term. And then because the greening efforts actually make them really healthy spaces to be in, you know, low VOC paints. Better air quality control, better lighting. We do things like light shades in all of the windows so natural light comes further into the center of the building. Even in these older buildings, actually, that works. But what we found is that in addition to lowered operating expenses, they become really popular places. And so they fill up and lease up very, very quickly, and they stay leased up. So this building actually was more or less vacant, and then after it redeveloped, it's become the home to like all of the coolest green and environmental entrepreneurs in Seattle. And it used to be at the edge of, sort of at the edge of the downtown in terms of the vibrancy of this place. You know, you probably wouldn't walk down this street before this happened because nothing was happening, and now it's sort of in the center of where things are happening in Seattle. So next slide. So we approach development with this understanding of sustainability. So development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we think about the environment, economy, and equity. These are three really important sort of key principles to the work that we do. And then the other thing that we've kind of been tooling around with lately is this idea that you know, we're trying to increase people's capacity to be happy. That it's not just about a financial return, that you know, a truly successful development, both from a market perspective and from a social perspective, is a place that people have a very good quality of life. Right. So our mission is to repair and strengthen the fabric of communities while preserving the land around them. Next slide. So I'm going to just go through a few projects that we've done. This is a planning project. The planning practice actually operates, we work with municipalities and nonprofits at multiple scales. So we're actually doing the comprehensive master plan for the city of Newark, which is an entirely different story. And if you know anything about Newark, it's complicated and exciting, I guess would be the way to put it. So we operate at that scale, and then we also, because of the real estate implementation experience, we find ourselves doing a lot of work on smaller scale opportunities to reimagine the redevelopment of inner city properties, right? And so we do community-based engagement and community-based planning around the redevelopment of those properties, but we're probably one of the few planners that are actually running pro formas at the same time, which is one of the reasons why I enjoy working there. So, but this project was actually another policy piece that we did, again, in cooperation with the EPA. They asked us to go up to Hartford, Connecticut, in the Capital Region Council of Governments, what they call CROG, had selected 4 or 5 suburban infill sites, actually, and I hesitate to talk about that at all because Ellen is such the expert on all of that. But what they asked us to do was to use those 3 or 4 sites as sort of an R&D, like research and development, to develop a user-friendly set of smart growth design and development guidelines. And so this is that, and you can find them on the EPA Smart Growth website, actually. There are a number of great, very detailed guidelines and criteria sets out there. Lead&D is an amazing one. What we tried to do with this was sort of be like a starter drug before Lead&D, right? The stepping stone, so that municipalities or smaller municipalities that would be a bit overwhelmed by all of the great stuff that's in Lead&D could sort of get their feet wet with these guidelines. And so we arranged these guidelines in sort of 3 key categories. The idea is you start regionally, and you don't do smart growth development without really picking the right location first. We just talked about location efficiency and how important that is. Once you've found the right location, you really have to make sure that you develop that location in a way that creates a great place that people want to be in, that's walkable. And then going from the neighborhood and block scale down to the building, in order to sort of complete the picture of sustainability, you want to install green building and sustainable infrastructure when you're redeveloping. So next slide. So the guidelines are far more in depth than this, so I'm just sort of quickly going through this. The key points of the prosperous smart growth locations component of the guidelines is that, preserve, to the extent possible, preserve natural resources, protect environmentally sensitive areas. This is particularly important in a place like Connecticut, where the amount of land, untouched land that exists is rapidly dwindling. Prime agricultural soils are rapidly dwindling, and so it doesn't make much sense to continue to develop on those places, especially when, as Alan pointed out, there are so many interesting gray field sites that could be redeveloped and could become very, very useful places again. So one way to do that too is to make sure that any new development is actually tied to existing development and infrastructure connections. And this is very important too for the efficient use of public resources in these small municipalities, because every time that somebody develops further out and leapfrogs, it's another investment that the municipality has to make generally in infrastructure that they then need to maintain for the long term. So, this is really an economic decision that public municipalities need to make as well. To the extent possible, new smart growth locations need to be connected to transportation. And I don't need to say much more about that because we saw the significant impact on what that means for the way that people live, right? And then finally, because these communities need to be vibrant and sort of rich places, that it's better to locate new development near community services, right? Near places that already have the infrastructure for community. Next slide. So then once you go from the site, the smart site location, you go into neighborhood plan and placemaking. There's extensive stuff written about this, but the 4 key things are: create a really great feeling neighborhood fabric and composition, develop streets that are that foster community, that people can walk on, that are comfortable walking on, that aren't given entirely to the car. Incorporate, to the extent possible, nature and open space into these urban environments, and provide for a mix of incomes and a mix of uses so that people at all scales of the sort of socioeconomic spectrum have the opportunity to participate. Next slide. And then finally, that's all the planning, but when you get into the bricks and mortar, there are a number of things that you can do to make sure that what you're building is sustainable in the long term. And, you know, certainly high performance buildings, using green building materials, using sustainable and indigenous landscaping, installing green infrastructure, you know, using green construction best practices. And then also, because it's not just about the bricks and mortar, it's about making sure that behaviors change too. And, you know, if it's one thing to install a really high-performance HVAC system into a building, but if nobody really knows how to use it or decides not to use it, it's kind of, well, it is waste. It's a huge waste, right? So, and lots of times these things are incredibly easy to do, actually, and so it's just a matter of really being thoughtful and empathetic about the way people live in these buildings and making sure that they're accessing to the furthest extent possible the benefits of the things that you're installing. Next. So I'm just going to go sort of quickly through a few projects. So this was a project. This is a project in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We have a smart site location. It's right across from a recently refurbished transit center. Silver Gardens is and I'm going to sort of cheat right now on some of the stats for this, but you can go to the next slide, please. So Silver Gardens is a 77,000 square foot development project. It's about $12.5 million, at least the first phases. It was completed about a year ago. It's actually won several awards for Green Building Awards. I believe that it ended up at LEED Platinum certification. And we actually use LEED as a certification, but we also use the Enterprise Green Communities guidelines as well. Next slide. So this is actually phase 2, I believe, and we're still working on the wind turbine thing. We'll see how that ends up. This is financed by multiple financing sources. There are low-income housing tax credits in this project. It's a mixed income project, so low, medium, and moderate income people can live here. It's very colorful. Next slide. And even within a single block project like this, we think it's important to provide spaces for community. And so this project incorporates a central courtyard, and then as much as we can within this kind of desert environment, right, provide green spaces. The next one is in Stamford, Connecticut. Looks like the S slipped there. Next slide. So again, this is located right next to transit. This is the Metro North Line and Amtrak, actually. Next slide. And this is a multi-phase project that has, next slide. So what's interesting about this one too is that it's really embedded right into the fabric of the city. It's at the edge of a revitalizing neighborhood. It's very close to a significant job center. And obviously, the train station is just right there. You couldn't really be any closer to the train station without actually living in the train station. Next. And so it's a multi-phase project. The Metro Green apartments at the bottom were completed about a year ago and have completely leased up. That's a 100% affordable housing project. At a mix of incomes, again, like the others that we do. Everything that we do is a mix of incomes because we feel like that it's incredibly important for the resiliency of a place for there to be that mix of incomes, right? There's 2 other phases that are currently under development, including the residential garage, the lofts, and then the Green Residences building. The Green Residences building, I believe, is going to be will include market rate units. Next slide. So there's a picture of that. That's the rendering. It actually looks almost exactly like the rendering, so you'll just have to believe me on that one. Next slide. Again, like all of the other projects that we do, we think it's incredibly important to provide these open spaces that are sort of deeply connected to the building to provide people a place to be outside and engage. This one is actually cut onto the corner of the street, so it's like a little piazza, which is important because it allows for people as they're approaching the building, even if they don't live there, to take part in the sort of public nature of that space. Next slide. This is another street view. That's actually the second phase, which is not under construction yet. Next. Under construction. Next. So then this is the last project. So this one is particularly interesting, I think, because it shows how you can accommodate a huge variety of mixed types within a relatively small site. It actually accommodates a huge variety of uses as well. It's a 27-acre infill site in Denver that was started in the mid-90s and completed in around, I think, 2006. It's called Highlands Garden Village. Next slide. This one is really fascinating because it used to be an amusement park. And so there were all these incredible memories that people had, that lived near here. People lived across the street from an amusement park. I mean, if you're a kid, that's like, it doesn't compute. But there were a lot of sensitivities to how this site would be redeveloped, obviously, because it held a special place in the hearts of a lot of people, right? But at the same time, it sat defunct for quite some time before there was any redevelopment, so there also was sort of harboring resentment about this big dead spot in the middle of the neighborhood, right? So this process actually underwent probably countless neighborhood meetings and discussions and work with the city, work with residents to come up with a plan that people were more or less aligned behind. That's an important point about redeveloping in cities, I think, is that I think, we sort of hear, developers get a bad name when they're not, because they come in and just say, you're going to have this, right? And that the numbers suggest, actually demand that this will be what you have, right? And, there's a lot of animosity because a lot of bad stuff was built as a result of that, and stuff that people didn't have a say in, right? And so we really strongly believe that a community engagement process or a civic engagement process is absolutely vital to the success of these kinds of developments. And what we found, in addition to just being great PR for the work that you're doing, and that as you move forward with a complex development project, having consensus behind you, right, is just makes a lot of sense economically too, because you're not going to spend as much time in the entitlements process. But what we found is if you do it right, you actually learn a lot, right? You learn a lot about the way, you should be imagining this new place, right? The people that live next door to these places know a lot better than you what it is, right? Or what it could be or what it should be, right? An example of that is we were working in Newark in a neighborhood called the Ironbound, which is a strong sort of Portuguese Brazilian neighborhood. And they had a 22-acre beer brewery site. I don't have pictures of it here, but they had a 22-acre beer brewery site that was the sort of beating heart of the neighborhood until 1979 when the brewery left, right? So imagine an incredibly tightly knit community and dense neighborhood, and at the center of it is 22 acres, right? That just vanishes, right? And so people actually call it like Black Friday when it happened. And then somebody came in a year and a half later and bought the place and then bricked up all the windows, right? And turned it into warehousing, which is no jobs and trucks, right? No jobs and trucks. So since 1980, that place has been this giant mark, this giant open wound essentially in the neighborhood. And what we said about the site was that it's not a place anymore, it's just a memory, right? So everybody remembers what it was. And because of that, they actually couldn't imagine what it could be because they were always sort of locked into the memory of the place, right? So, but we went through a sort of, an empathetic engagement process with the community and kind of walked through the potential of what things could be. And this is an example of how you actually learn from the community. So we were hired to go in there and figure out zoning recommendations that could be given over to the city and then rezoned so that when the market turned and it could be redeveloped, that what was redeveloped was actually what reflected what the community wanted to see, right? And so we thought, this is going to be a big, long, arduous discussion about housing and density, right? Because that's what we're used to hearing. It's going to be about 3 stories or 4 stories. It's going to be about affordability. It's going to be about all these things. So we went in and we were totally prepared for that discussion. And within 3 minutes of the first meeting, we realized, no, they don't want housing. None. They want jobs, right? And so because of that engagement, right? I mean, that's sort of oversimplifying things, but because of that engagement, the idea for that project, that 22 acres, shifted from a housing development significantly to become what we're calling a green job center. So it's about reopening the windows in this place and bringing new light, sustainable manufacturing uses back into the neighborhood, right? And so, a developer would have come in and said, this is housing, let's raise it, let's do housing. But the opportunity and by the way, the returns are going to be pretty good on the light manufacturing, because it turns out there's actually a significant demand for small manufacturing spaces in that area, right? So it makes sense economically, but it also makes sense socially. So anyway, back to Highlands Garden Village. Next slide. So this is after demolition. What you'll notice is that, well, all the roller coasters came down, unfortunately. We couldn't quite figure out how to make a roller coaster into housing. Maybe we didn't talk to the right people. I mean, maybe the children would have helped on that. But there was this incredibly beautiful theater, actually, you can see sort of in the center of the site, and this even more beautiful carousel. And that carousel was home to countless first kisses, right? Countless romantic moments, right? Countless memories, right? And so it was really important to kind of identify those things in the site and say, this is the character of the place. We can preserve it and then build off of it, right? Next slide. So this is the plan that we came up with. We worked with Peter Calthorpe, and I believe there's 306 housing units on the site. 1 minute left? 1 minute left like 5 minutes ago, right? Okay. So we'll just go quickly through it. But so the next slide. So there's a variety of housing types here. You have multifamily. Next slide. Single family. The single family is actually aligned on the side of the blocks that's facing the existing single family, so it blends seamlessly into the neighborhood. Next slide. We have a type called co-housing, actually, and co-housing is basically a community of like-minded people coming together and sort of saying, you know what, we want to develop a community of a residential community for ourselves. And what people that do that do, in this case at least, is they sort of agreed that they were going to take smaller and more compact housing units and sort of live closer together and use the land a little bit more efficiently. Next slide. And then they also participate with each other in these community gardens. It's really actually quite beautiful. Next slide. Here's a community garden. Another one. For a variety of reasons, including stormwater management, it was important to put green spaces throughout the site. And so if you look back at the plan, you would see them very well incorporated throughout the site. Next slide. Going back to the co-housing, they actually built a communal sort of building that houses a large kitchen, and they have a weekly meal together. They do have a parking problem. Next slide. Yeah, we didn't. The parking densities the ratios are all wrong here. We'll try and figure that out for the next time. Next slide. So this just is also showing that variety of house type is important. So these are single-family homes, but there's there are different kinds. Some of these homes actually have accessory units above the garages. So you can imagine those being used for people returning home from college, but also I think they're called granny flats for a reason. Next slide. More green. Next slide. So this is interesting too. I mean, we actually. One of the things that they attempted at first, we wanted to do xeriscaping, and some of the builders said no way, and so we put in grass, and then that failed, and so we went back to the xeriscaping. Next slide, and it looks really great. Next slide. This is just another picture of the co-housing. Next slide. So this is a seniors building, right? So this is actually a affordable housing project specifically for seniors. One of the really great things about having this in the place is that you actually broaden not only the socioeconomic spectrum but the age spectrum, and there's really great benefits to having children, people from all steps of life living in the same place. Next slide. This is another affordable multifamily project. Next slide. So the other component of the project, because we wanted to try and meet the sort of walkable needs of people, is the commercial part. And Chuck Perry, who's head of Perry Rosen, will tell you that this was the most difficult part, that the housing was quite easy in terms of development, but actually getting the commercial to go was very difficult. But they managed to do it and finished it in 2006. It includes doctors, there's a liquor store, I think, there's a wine shop. There is a Starbucks, health club, all sorts of things. Next. And then it also has a 28,000 square foot grocery store, which was, I believe, one of the first LEED corn shell grocery stores ever. This was incredibly difficult because 28,000 square feet is actually a really weird size for a grocery store. But luckily, these people, Sunflower Markets, had developed a model that works for that size. One of the things that we struggled with is we really pushed hard to get the parking ratios down. So I think we went from 1 per 200 square feet to 1 per 350 square feet. And actually that became a difficulty for us because the retailers were having, they weren't quite sure they wanted to move in here. And so we had to get some people in to sort of prove the concept, and now it's going. Although parking is in high demand there still. Next. So there's the market. Next. Okay, and finally, one really important aspect of this place, and I think all great urban development is having really fantastic public space. This is a stormwater retention feature, but it's actually the main sort of lawn plaza for the project, and it sits right at the terminus of this beautiful historic theater. Next slide. And so people use this for movies in the evening. You know, it's filled a lot with programming. Next slide. In the daytime as well. I don't know. That guy in the middle doesn't look too happy though. I don't know what his deal is. Next slide. Again, just the different age groups that are in the neighborhood. Next slide. And then this is just the interior of the carousel. And what you see in there is a labyrinth, and because that's just sort of like signifying that this space could also be a contemplative space, and that it's important to have places to be quiet, right? So lots of wonderful life moments happening here still, weddings, you know, big family gatherings and so on. So that's it. I went way over my time, I guess. So, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. What just an empowering presentation. Broome and Tioga, can we do this? Yes. Yes, we can. You've given a whole new meaning to shoe boxes.
Yeah.
You and your wife are definitely sustainability superheroes, and I commend
I'll just
you.
say that it works for two people, but if you're planning on moving into a different phase of your life, that, you know. So yeah, we're looking for a new place.
Great. We have time for about 2 questions. Anybody in the audience?
We thought all of that was great. We don't have a lot of transit here, and just bus service, you know, so I think a lot of people are probably thinking, well, how does this all relate to us type of thing. But when you look at our area and the underperforming asphalt and vacant spaces here in the urban core and things like that, could you just talk a little bit about maybe how these same type of concepts can be scaled for an area like, you know, Triple Cities here, you know, Binghamton and Johnson City?
Right. Well, so this is similar to, I think this is quite similar to the towns that we were looking at around Hartford, Connecticut. They actually have, I apologize, do you have buses here? Or? Yeah. Okay. So they have buses there, and they're, but you know, let's be honest, not many people are riding those, and so this idea that you would take the bus into the city is probably a bit far-fetched right now for those places around. I'm going to talk a little bit about Hartford because I think I'll talk about that from a place of knowledge rather than here. But I mean, one of the really, so here's the thing. I think the country has to commit to regional planning efforts, actually. I mean, that's the big thing, right? And some wonderful things have actually started happening, right? Over the last couple of years, we've seen this incredible thing happen where HUD decided that maybe it makes sense, if we're talking about affordable housing, to talk to DOT, right? And DOT said if we want to make sure that we're developing in a sustainable way, we should maybe talk to the EPA. So, you know, they formed the Sustainable Communities, Livable Communities Partnership, right? Which is deployed right now, lots and lots of federal funding to do regional and local planning for the employment of things like transit, right? So CROG actually got a large sustainable communities grant, and they're going to start studying these things, right? So that's difficult, and I understand that. So I think alternatively, though, and this is to what Ellen talks about a lot, is that even if you're not connecting these places by transit, that there's still a huge opportunity to make them more walkable within themselves, right? And that in that just by making sure that you meet more needs of people within a walkable place, you're going to really start reducing car trips, right? I mean, again, if I can walk across the street to go to the grocery store instead of drive 5 miles, and I have to go to the grocery store twice a week, I mean, like those things start to add up. So I don't know if that's particularly satisfying, but that's...
My name is Chris Carrick. I manage the energy program for the Central New York Regional Planning Board. We were one of the 800 communities that did not get one of those HUD grants.
Yeah.
But we did receive a grant from the EPA through the Climate Showcase Communities program.
Oh, actually, that was what the thing that we did with CROG, I think that was funded under the same grant. So
we're providing assistance to 9 communities to do smart growth planning. And one of the things we're trying to work with EPA on is how to quantify making some of these smart growth retrofits in terms of carbon benefits, and we're having a hard time doing that. And I'm wondering if the BTU tool that you've developed could be ramped up and applied on a community scale in terms of helping the planning.
I'm actually really glad that you asked that question, because so the BTU, it's really an illustration more than anything of a concept. And the reason why I say that is because we were only able to use only the highest level data, national average data, right? And as soon as you start looking into the specifics of a place, those numbers are going to fluctuate, obviously, right? Because, one place has buses, the other place has New York City has the subway, and, that's totally different than the transit that Atlanta has, right? And so one of the things that we recommend at the end of this paper is that really this is just the very, very, very beginning of studying this issue, and that what we need to do is actually do the same exercise at the regional level, or maybe even the neighborhood level, just to understand more specifically what the impacts are at these places. And one of the things, again, that we talk about a lot in our practice right now is that there are huge opportunities out there for us to learn a lot more about this stuff rapidly. And one of the reasons is because we've all got these things, right? Something like one of these things, and so we're all essentially sensors, and so there's all this tremendous data that's out there that can be captured and can be used to sort of quantify the benefits, and basically to quantify human mobility, right? And so one of the things that we'd like to do is maybe create an iPhone app or some kind of app actually that would give us volunteer geographic information that would actually let us sort of dive in a more fine-grained way to understanding what that really is, what that BTU slide really is. And I think that's important for 2 reasons. One is because we need to start quantifying this stuff in a better way. But the other is we have to start communicating to people what these decisions mean to them, right? And we can't communicate to them in this sort of punitive way, right? Like this way that says, you're burning too much gas and you're doing this, Like, that's not particularly compelling to anybody, right? What's compelling is when you can talk about quality of life. Like, how does this stuff actually affect the quality of your life, and how it will affect the quality of life of your children? And so I'm really interested in developing ways that we can research this stuff that not only gives us the data, but actually is a PR campaign for understanding better how these decisions affect our lives. So, thank you.
Thank you again, Matthew. And I think I have your next campaign with Ellen, building a better burb to reduce your BMI and BTU. Are we ready to go? We also wanted to be a rosebud here in Broome and Tioga County for you to embark on your next project. So tell Jonathan Rose.